I welcome Reverend James Gaither to be with us today. I am grateful, but I'm also assured by your presence. Thank you very much to be here with us in this ongoing collaboration. Here is James Gaither.
Thank you, Maya. It's always a delight and an honor to be with you all. So thank you for that ongoing opportunity. So let's spend a little time in meditation. This spiritual service that you have every week begins with focusing our attention on the beauty of the divine through music and through the reading of the daily word and the affirmations. We gradually expanding our awareness of the divine and deepening our consciousness. We hear the daily word. So let's continue that process of deepening and raising and expanding our awareness by spending some time in meditation. I invite you to set aside any objects, any concerns about the past or the future, and to be here now. Let your awareness be in this very present moment. Feel the flow of life through you, which is the presence of the divine. Feel it in your breath, the energy that flows through your body. In the Psalms we read, "Be still and know that I am God." Be still and know that I am God. And so now we become more inwardly still as we are outwardly still. We contemplate, what can this be? What can this mean? Where is this I am God? This name, I am, suggests self, but not the human ego, not the personality, not the body. The divine self that moves mind and body, that goes through the world and the conditions of the world, unchanging, divine self. The Hindus call the Atman self, they call God Brahman. So the self, Atman is Brahman, means the self is God. This is a deep and mysterious idea, the I am God. Or if we think of ourselves as a personality or this changing body, it does not seem to us that this can be the divine, that this can be the self. Indeed, the body continually changes as conditions continually change. This is the creative process that emanates from the divine, and that also is the very presence of the divine. But what is it that is the unchanging self? It is not this body which is continually changing. It is not our emotional states which are continually changing. It is not the thoughts that flow through our minds, for those too change. There is in us something higher, unchanging, divine. This is the I am God, the Atman. And so when we still the mind, the self, the I am God, the Atman, is revealed and takes over the flow of thought, the flow of feelings, the flow of bodily change, the flow of conditions. We let this divine omnipresence, this all-knowing omniscience, this omnipotence, all power, have its way in us. We let the Spirit move us. The Spirit goes where it listeth, as Jesus said. So in prayer, we are not seeking now any particular personal goal, any particular change in the world or in our world. We are not seeking that. We are seeking to be still and allow Spirit, the higher self, the true self, the unchanging self that is with us and has been with us everlastingly and eternally. We let that self be revealed, move our thoughts. Our thoughts need to be moved, change our feelings, our consciousness, if our consciousness needs to be changed, change our bodies and our conditions, if those things need to be changed. The mind be still, the heart be open to this presence, to this reality of what we are. This divine oneness means there's really only one eternal, everlasting self that manifests and expresses through this mind and through this body and through the conditions in the world. And the more still we are, the more that activity is divine, the more that activity is beautiful and good, wise and loving. That divine light, which transcends all earthly light, that divine illumination, which brings the realization into our consciousness that we are one, that we are divine, that we are the very presence of life, love, light. We let this divine light and love and life fill our consciousness now as we become ever more still, ever more open. We enter into that stillness, that silence. We hold to this idea in the silence. Be still and know that I am. In the silence, we experience both relaxation and energy, stillness, and the movement of spirit in us, as us, through us, radiating out into the world, transform it a moment at a time to bring forth fuller expression, all the divine qualities of the Infinite One. We close this time of stillness with hearts filled with joy and gratitude. We close this time of stillness, the awareness that the Christ, divine idea, the divine self that was in Jesus, the Buddha that was in Gautama, is in us, and we are grateful, and so it is. Amen. All right. Well, as I said, I'm just delighted to be here. I hope you experienced a time of renewal and illumination during our opening prayer time, meditative time in this service. I'd like to begin this talk by sharing some wisdom from the Tao Te Ching. We find written in that book of Taoism, that original book of Taoism, these words: non-being penetrates non-space. Hence, I know the advantages of non-action. The doctrine without words, the advantage of non-action, few under heaven can realize these. And again, the person of superior integrity takes no action, nor has he a purpose for action. And again, pure and still, one can put things right everywhere under heaven. And again, the sage knows without journeying, understands without looking, accomplishes without acting. Finally, through non-action, no action is left undone. Well, these words seem strange and paradoxical. And so during this talk, I hope to unveil the meaning of this Taoist idea of non-action and how it applies to the season of Lent, which of course is a Christian tradition. So a kind of linking this ancient Chinese tradition with a modern Christian tradition. First, in order to contemplate this idea of non-action, I invite you to try to imagine a world in which we acted as little as possible, doing what is necessary, but little more. Imagine a world in which we valued stillness as much or more than we value activity. What would that world look like? Just think about it for a moment. Kind of stillness and peace over the earth. I imagine certain things that if there was more value placed on this idea of stillness, this idea of non-action, that a number of things would happen. I would imagine that there would be less use of gasoline for driving. We wouldn't drive around all the time. You might recall during the pandemic how empty the streets were, right? And how that you might not realize or might not have known that during that period, it lowered the levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. In a world that valued more stillness, there would be fewer electrical gadgets constantly drawing on power grids, and consequently lower costs of electricity and oil, from less use of cars, from less use of the power grid. And this, of course, would have a positive effect on what we call the problem or the crisis of climate change. And since war is an unnecessary activity, if everyone globally valued stillness and non-action, there wouldn't be any wars. People would be more at peace. They would have that inner stillness. More people would be at peace, and so there would be less gun violence. There would be reduction in crime. people would need less money because they would be doing fewer things. So they could choose more rewarding work with less concern about having a higher income to buy more stuff. Less work and technology would be directed towards personal items, therefore, and more towards things that are really helpful and necessary, like health productive technology. There would be less noise pollution. And I imagine that people would be more focused on what Confucius called the arts of peace: music, painting, crafts, those sorts of things. Now, what I visualize, perhaps wouldn't be exactly what would happen if we valued stillness more, but I suspect it would, or something like that. A more peaceful world, a calmer world. Transformative power of non-action and stillness is portrayed in many of the stories of the Bible. And interestingly, and I'll get into this a little bit if in a while, interestingly, these stories almost always include the number 40. Might be 40 years, might be 40 days, might be 40 hours. So saying that, I'm not going to remind you of the actual hundreds of uses of the number 40 that are found throughout the Bible, but I'm going to mention a few of the more significant ones. So, like one of the earliest ones was that it rained for 40 days to cause a flood in Genesis. Now, the purpose of this flood was to change the world. So Noah, the hero of the story, took a zoo cruise on the ark for 40 days. And when he ended that time and they came back out onto the dry land, Noah received a divine promise that God would not ever again send a flood to wipe out life on earth. So far, promise kept. And in that promise was the first appearance of a rainbow, according to the story. The rainbow in the sky is a sign of the promise. So every time we see a rainbow, we may think of that promise of the divine support. That's one example, or actually a couple of examples of 40. The number 40 is prominent in the story of Moses. Moses was raised in the Pharaoh's house for 40 years. It was after that period of 40 years that he realized his identity with the Israelites. He realized that the enslaved Israelites were his people and that he wanted to help them. And he tried to help them by killing an Egyptian, which may not have been the best idea. And so Moses then knew that the Egyptians were after him and he fled to Midian. And how long did he stay there? He stayed there for 40 years. And then he went back and he led the Israelites out of Egypt. And he went up to the top of Mount Sinai and fasted for 40 days. And it was after that that he came back with the 10 Commandments. And this return from the mountaintop with this list or these tables of commandments represents a higher order of spirituality, a transformational change, just as the flood represented a transformational change on earth. So then the Israelites stayed in the wilderness for 40 years. And it was after that staying in the wilderness for 40 years that they finally acted and went into the promised land. Later, we get the story of Elijah, who fasted for 40 days and then waited on Mount Horeb for a revelation of God. God was not to be found in the fire. God was not to be found in the whirlwind. God was found in Elijah in the still small voice. Another transformation. And of course, we know Jesus fasted in the wilderness for 40 days. He came out from that stillness and non-action, transformed from a humble carpenter to a spiritual master. And of course, it is this story, the story of the 40 days in the wilderness, that is commemorated by the Lenten season. That's why the church had instituted this 40 days to commemorate that 40 days in the wilderness, leading up to, of course, Easter. And you might think, well, that's the end of the 40s, but it's not. Now, Jesus, we know, according to the story, was resurrected after 3 days in the tomb. Now, there's a tradition, a long-standing tradition in the church, in church writings, that Jesus was in the tomb for 40 hours. In other words, part of Friday, the 24 hours of Saturday, and part of Sunday. So you might think 8 hours on Friday, 24 hours of Saturday, 8 hours on Sunday, adding up to 40 hours. And then the book of Acts tells us that Jesus appeared to his disciples and taught them for 40 days after the resurrection. I've mentioned all of the examples of this, but why is the number 40 associated with an idea of a period of transformation, of a coming into a higher order? Well, the Hebrew word for 40 is derived from a word meaning four, as you might have suspected, but the word also means to sprawl out on the ground, to sprawl out on the ground. In other words, to rest, to be still. And it also suggests the common ancient posture of prayer, which is the kneeling and placing one's hands on the ground. So the 4 points of the body touching the earth in an attempt to connect with the divine. So that's that same posture of prayer is still found in Islam today. And of course, prayer is inner stillness and non-action. In its highest sense, it's simply waiting for the Spirit to move us. It is, as Emerson said, the Spirit of God pronouncing his works good, contemplating the facts of life from the highest point of view. Prayer is this inner stillness and non-action. If we think about 4, it represents the divine idea of stability, solidity, support, and even substance. And it is especially associated with the earth. Now, this is true not only in the Bible, but in other systems of numbers. We usually think of numbers as quantities, but they're not just quantities, they're also shapes, and they signify qualities. The shape of a number is the geometric figure that has the same number of points. So 4, the number 4, 4 points can be a rectangular shape, and it also can be and is the simplest 3-dimensional shape that can be made, connecting points in this way in geometry. The simplest 3-dimensional shape is the tetrahedron. That's the shape of a tripod, like a camera tripod. You've got the point at the top and the 3 points touching the earth. Tetrahedron. So the shape of 4 comes into play when we want to set something on the ground or the floor to support us or to support things we have. So tables, chairs, tents generally have 4 points touching the earth, or alternatively, they have the shape of the tripod, the shape of the tetrahedron. And so this number 4, I suggest to you, is an archetypal divine idea that shows up, as I said, especially as related to the earth. For example, we find references in the Bible to the 4 corners of the earth, and we still have the common idea that there are 4 primary directions: north, south, east, and west. The ancient philosophers and astrologers believed that there are 4 elements, that there were 4 elements: earth, wind, fire, and water. Science now recognizes that there are 4 phases of matter roughly corresponding to those ancient elements. There are 4 phases of matter. I don't know about you, but when I was in school, they taught me there were 3: solid, liquid, and gas. But in the last, I don't know, in the years since I got out of high school, I guess I would say, scientists have recognized a 4th phase of matter that is different from solid, liquid, or gas. They call it plasma, interestingly. It's electrified gas. Plasma is what you find in your neon lights, but it's also the basic phase of matter of the sun and the stars. So again, 4 associated with the cosmos in a larger sense. Science also conceives of the universe, the whole universe, as 4-dimensional, right? In physics, there's a 3-dimension of space and time, which science now sees as a combined sort of expression of the universe, the 4 dimensions rather than the 3 dimensions, space and time. So we think of an object as physically substantial if it occupies the 3 dimensions of space for some duration of time. That's how we recognize something, an object, as substantial. And the more and the longer it endures, we might say the more substantial it is. Oh, I've got one more for you. Okay. The most stable part of every living creature is its DNA. We know that. If you watch crime scene shows, they're always looking at the DNA that's left behind on hair and the skin cells and that sort of thing. It's always there. It's always in the body. It constructs and reconstructs the body. Now, here's where the four comes in. According to biology, our DNA, this complicated stuff that is sort of the, I don't know, the structure or the structuring thing in our bodies, the molecule is that DNA is constructed from the same four molecules. Doesn't matter who you are, doesn't matter what kind of animal or plant you are, there's just these four molecules that the scientists call the alphabet of the DNA, arranged in different ways, spelling out different structures, but they're only, all that is needed are the four. And the shape and quality of four was also understood in Pythagorean philosophy as representing solidity, because again, it's the simplest geometric figure, the tetrahedron, which has 4 points. You can't make a three-dimensional figure from anything less than 4 points. And the Pythagoreans also believed that 4 represented justice. And by justice, they meant the universe in justice, the universe in balance. It symbolizes, again, the idea of balance. So scientists and some philosophers, searching to understand the substance of the universe, have imagined that everything is made of the smallest particles in the universe, whatever those smallest particles might be. I think this might be an intellectual dead end, because no matter how small a particle is externally, it has something unknown internally. There's always something inside. For example, if we say that the quark is the smallest particle, we can ask, well, what is a quark made of? What's the substance of it? What's inside of it? We might finally throw up our hands and say, well, it's made of energy. But energy, of course, isn't a particle. It's not even a wave. A wave is a form, such as an ocean wave. Energy, scientifically understood, is the potential to cause change or the work that can be done, for example, by force fields or objects in motion. So even energy doesn't quite get us at what everything is made of. Every philosophical or scientific theory of substance has been some idea of form. So I can only conclude that substance is just that, the idea of form, but not any particular material form. It's simply the idea, the divine idea in divine mind of substance is the idea of form. So we form ideas in our consciousness, and in doing that, we are accessing divine substance, the divine idea of substance. Simplest conceivable geometric idea of form is that humble tetrahedron. So we can think of that 4 as symbolizing substance in those terms as well. So stillness is associated with some substance and the number 4. But what about the number 40? Okay, so I'm going to take you deeper into the world of numbers, but remember, I'm talking about divine ideas. 40 is, as you know, 4 times 10, right? And 10 signifies attaining a higher order. So if we go from the idea of stillness to the idea of entering a higher order or transformation through stillness. So 10 signifies attaining that higher level. 10 times any number raises that number to a higher order, right? So 2 times 10 is 20, and so forth. And of course, in science, in working with large numbers, they will use the idea of the powers of 10 to raise numbers to ever higher levels. So 10 squared, or 10 times 10, 10 squared is 100, 10 to the third power is 1,000, 10 to the sixth power is 1,000,000, and so on and so forth. So in order, working with large numbers, in order to raise the numbers to a next higher level, they use the powers of 10. Symbolically, 10 represents a transition to a higher power, a higher state of consciousness, higher power in math, a higher power in the body, higher power in the consciousness. It's symbolism. It's the divine idea. So 40, or 4 times 10, symbolizes attaining a transformation of substance, a transformation of self, a transformation of the world through stillness and non-action, as again illustrated by all the biblical examples I cited that include the number 40. And if I can go back to the Pythagoreans, who famously worked out a lot of the symbolism of numbers, they considered 4 a perfect number and 10 a divine number. So that's all I have to say about 4 and 40. So I'm sure you're relieved at that. Let's move on. See how this all connects. Most often in life, our first impulse when trouble arrives is to act, to fix things. We've got to fix it. We've got to take some action to fix it. And action is often appropriate. We need to act to sustain life. However, what is not always appreciated is that stillness and non-action are also transformational, as symbolized in all these Bible stories and in this symbolism of numbers. Sometimes the best way to fix a problem is to be still and do nothing. That seems very counterintuitive, doesn't it? We always have to do something. But if you think about it, we use non-action and stillness for a variety of purposes commonly without even thinking about it. We use non-action and stillness for healing all the time. Got a cold? What do they tell you? Get plenty of rest, right? Drink plenty of fluids, get plenty of rest. Be still. After surgery, patients don't jump up out of bed and run around. They don't get up and do calisthenics. They get bed rest to let the body heal, or to let, as I like to put it, the divine activity of healing take place. They become more still to let that activity move through them and continue and complete the healing process. We sleep because we know that if we don't, we are wearing the body down. And also lack of sleep, lack of sleep affects the mind too. It can cause hallucinations. I've experienced this myself when I've tried to stay up too long and started seeing things and hearing things. So rest rejuvenates us. Rest is part of the balance of life. And of course, we know in unity, in our teaching, that prayer and meditation in the stillness has therapeutic effects on the body and the consciousness. We know that in our teaching. Frankly, medical researchers know that as well. They've done all kinds of studies showing the power of meditation or the therapeutic value of it. And we also know that it's in stillness and in openness that doors are opened for us for guidance, for inspiration, as well as for healing and peace. So, for example, as a Unity student, if you wanted to access divine substance to meet your needs or to increase your prosperity, one of the best things you can do is to take affirmations into the silence, to be still and take words or images of prosperity into the silence. So you might become still, quiet, centered, and affirm something like, infinite spiritual substance meets my every need and prospers me abundantly. Or divine substance is my instant, constant, and limitless supply. And you just hold those words, that idea in your consciousness for a moment, you can almost feel yourself attracting supply. Divine substance is my instant, constant, and limitless supply. Now, this is not to say that we are never to act, that non-action is the way to be at all times. But it is to say that we need to recognize the importance of balance. And there's a little deeper meaning to non-action that I'll go into in a few moments. But again, I want to just point out how we act in the world. Government leaders, for example, almost always try to fix the world by taking action and making speeches, doing something. And that can sometimes work, but sometimes less is more. Sometimes it's better to let things alone. So true wisdom is knowing when to act and when not to act. When is action the best course and when is not action the best course? Again, it requires wisdom. But there are some things we know. That rules and government action can protect and serve the people. On the other hand, the fewer the rules the government imposes, the more freedom people have to act. And so there is this balance, even in governing, how much, how many rules need to be imposed without restricting personal liberty or freedom. As I mentioned, the Pythagoreans taught that justice is balance. And so we may think of it in these terms. Justice or wisdom is a balance of action and inaction. Well, most of us are not involved in making government decisions, but many of us have been parents or have seen parents, and parents also have to find this balance. We know that parents can be negligent, not acting enough, but they can also be overprotective and impose too many restrictions. Sometimes it's best to provide guidance and discipline. Sometimes it's best to let children learn from experience, as we say, to make their own mistakes and learn. Well, this brings me back to the Taoist ideas I shared at the very beginning of the talk. Remind you of a couple of those statements. The doctrine without words, the advantages of non action, few under heaven can realize these. Through non action, no action is left undone. I want to explain this, as I said, this idea of stillness and non action at a little bit deeper level than this sort of superficial notion of whether or not we're physically still or physically active. Because in the context of the whole Taoist philosophy, we take all of the teachings together and put this idea of non-action in that. We can see that non-action means allowing or waiting for the Tao to move us. It's a letting go of always being motivated by personal goals and personal objectives. As taught in mysticism, it's a kind of letting go of personal will. Non-action is an inner stillness that we can have even during the most strenuous activities. Non-action is an inner stillness. So you can be acting and at the same time not worrying, calm within yourself, even as you are involved in physical activities. Moses, Elijah, Jesus all waited to be moved by spirit, not moved by their personal goals, not moved by their personal desires, but to be moved by spirit. They may have waited 40 hours or 40 days or 40 years, depending on how spirit moved them. So we may think of, going back to the idea of the 40 days of Lent, we may think of Lent as a time to make springtime resolutions, giving up meat, chocolate, alcohol, or some other pleasure we indulge in. But Lent doesn't have to involve specific resolutions, as if it were a kind of spring New Year's. If we recognize the spiritual meaning of Lent, we may see it in a new light. Lent is a reminder that time spent in stillness, letting go, being open, is transformative, transformational. It's the power of silence and stillness to transform. Now, this does not mean refraining from all action during this season, but taking time, maybe more time than we ordinarily do, to be still, to meditate, to maybe let go of some unnecessary activities, and especially to maintain the idea of inner stillness, inner calm, to wait for spirit to move us. So for the 40 days of the Lenten season, why not choose to engage in more non-action, more stillness, more meditation? I assure you that this approach will be far more beneficial and pleasant than giving up chocolate or wine. Namaste.
Thank you.